Well, we are in part 3 of the series, Unshakable, and together we're on this journey to discover how do we have unwavering faith living, in uncertain times. 3 months ago when I first started to work on this series, there was uncertainty in our world, but now it just feels like throughout this entire series, uncertainty continues to increase and increase. War in the Middle East, and it feels like the chatter about World War III is just increasing, and the political divide and division and intensity of that, the polarization politically in our country just continues to increase and increase, and then there's just hurricane after hurricane and the destruction and the loss of life. It just feels like uncertainty is everywhere. And I haven't even mentioned individual, personal uncertainty. What are you facing right now, just personally? Is there financial uncertainty? Is there marriage uncertainty? Is there parenting uncertainty? Is there job uncertainty? Is there health uncertainty? You're just waiting to hear back from the doctors? What personal uncertainty are you facing? And here's the thing with uncertainty. The emotion driving right behind uncertainty is fear. In fact, several years ago, I did this series called 800-Pound Gorilla. It was all about mental health. And part 1 of that series, if you haven't watched it or forgot about it, go back and watch it. Part 1, I talked about fear. In fact, our brain, there's this little part called the amygdala. And the amygdala, it's that part of our brain that sends us into the fight or flight response mode. It's what takes in fear. And here's the thing with fear. Fear is something that we see. It's something real. Like when you see a bear, you see an alligator, you see a snake, or you see a smile, or whatever makes you fearful, or when you see it, right? That's real. It's a real fear in front of you. But anxiety is what we perceive might happen, what we think might happen. Uncertainty, what could happen in the future. But our body responds in the same way. Whether it's real fear or perceived fear, it still responds the same way. And that makes what's going on within our world and in our individual lives so difficult, emotionally and mentally, and spiritually. And the only way to keep fear in its place, the only way to minimize fear, whether real or perceived, the only way to overcome fear is faith. Faith. But here's what I know in my life, and I'm sure this is probably true in your life. It's so easy to say faith. I have faith. It's kind of that church answer, right? It's like, you just got to have faith. But when uncertainty is redlined and fear is just pounding within your heart, your soul, your mind, your emotions, spiritually, right? It's real easy for faith to go drifting off to sea, for faith to just completely dissipate. It's gone. And you see, the question, and it's probably one of the most important questions for you, for me, to have an answer for is, what is your faith anchored to? So as uncertainty redlines, as fear pounds behind uncertainty, faith doesn't dissipate. So what is your faith anchored to? What is your faith anchored to? And that's where we're going today in part 3 of Unshakable. Now, where we're going in part 3 of the story, we're in the book of Daniel. We have to just remember what we looked at in part 2, that part of the story. You see, King Nebuchadnezzar was the world leader, the world powerful leader of Babylon at that time. He has a dream. He calls in his wise men. No one could tell him what his dream was or interpret it, but Daniel comes in. And Daniel was able, because God gave him the dream and told him what the interpretation was. Daniel comes in and looks at the king and says, "Hey, king, this is your dream. This is the statue. And the gold head of the statue represents you, king, and Babylon. And the rest of the statue, each piece is just different empires that are going to come and go. Every empire is going to crumble, except God's going to establish a kingdom, this mighty mountain, here and forevermore. It's an amazing interpretation to his dream. And when Nebuchadnezzar hears his dream and the interpretation, he falls to his face in front of Daniel, and he says, "Surely your God is a God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries." I mean, this, cue the music, right? This is the epic ending to such an epic story, right? He falls on his face and oh, your God is the God of gods, right? So we end chapter 2, right? And it's wow, Nebuchadnezzar, woo! And then all of a sudden you flip the page to chapter 3, and right away, what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He commands that golden idols be set up. And this wasn't just some small golden idol. We're told that this gold idol was 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. This is massive. It probably wasn't solid gold. It was gold leaf, but still, it was ominous, and it was awe-inspiring, and it was impressive. And he commanded that all the people worship it. Now, who were they worshiping? Now, a clue is actually in the name Nebuchadnezzar, because he wasn't asking them specifically to worship him, but every king was connected to a Babylonian god. And we know who Nebuchadnezzar was connected to because, the very first part of his name, Nebu, is the name of the Babylonian god Nabu. Nabu was the second most important god in the entire Babylonian pantheon. You see, Nabu was the son of Marduk. Marduk was the Babylonian god who was a king of all gods. So Nabu's his son. Nabu was the god of wisdom and writing, which is really cool when you think about the specific intentionality of God. You go back to chapter 1, what does God give Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's 3 friends? What does God give them? He gives them wisdom. Right? I love God's intentionality. He gives them wisdom, and the king looks at them and is like, man, they're wiser than anyone else in my entire empire. As the king knows, he's named after the God of wisdom. Chapter 2, what does Daniel do? He interprets this dream, which is really a prophecy of what's to come. And guess what Nabu was known as? The God of prophecy. You see the intentionality of what God is doing as he, leads through this pagan Babylonian king. And so Nebuchadnezzar sets up this massive idol to the god Nabu. He commands all of his governors and prefects and officials to come in, and they gather around this massive idol, and we're told that the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do." Remember, what the king says goes, and this is early on in his, leadership, and he was establishing his authority everywhere. And he commanded, as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. The herald gets done. The band plays the music. And we're told that all bowed. Almost all bowed. There was 3 that didn't bow: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, you might be wondering, where's Daniel? We're not sure where Daniel was at this moment. What we do know is Daniel had been promoted to a really high official position in the king's government. So more than likely, he had been sent out on king's business. He was away from the capital city at that moment, which would make sense. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down. And there were some wise men, the same wise men who were just humiliated when they couldn't tell the king his dream and they couldn't interpret it. So their pride was hurt, their ego was hurt. And they noticed that these 3 Jewish men weren't falling down to worship. So they go to the king and they're like, "Hey, king, we just want to let you know that there's some Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, king. Hey, king, there's three. They don't listen to you. Hey, king, they don't respect you. Hey, king, they don't follow you. Hey, king, they don't fear you. See, ultimately, the king wanted people to fear him, to fear his position, to fear his power, to fear his authority, to fear him. And these wise men, again, their ego was bruised when they couldn't interpret the king's dream. We're now saying that there's three of these Jewish men connected to Daniel. They're all friends together, king, and they're not paying attention to you. They don't fear you. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. And we're told that the king was furious with rage. Why? Again, he was establishing his authority across all the kingdom. He was a new king. And he calls in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he asks this question, is it true? Now, you can almost tell there's some sympathy that he's extending to them. He'd already made his command, worship, you live, you don't worship, you die. But now he calls them in, and he's like, is this true? Like, you could tell. Why? Because a short period of time before, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were connected to Daniel, Daniel was able to tell him his dream, interpret the dream. The king fell down in front of Daniel and was like, surely you're God. So you can tell the king was like, man, I hope this isn't true. I hope this story isn't real. I hope these other wise men were just, they're just lying. Is it true? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego looked at them. And you can almost tell, like he was like, maybe this is true. And he reminds them, hey, just know, if you don't fall down and worship, I've already made my command. I've already made my decree. You're going to be thrown in the furnace. In fact, he goes, then, Nebuchadnezzar says, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Now, you think about uncertainty and you think about fear, and this is real fear. They're standing there. The furnace, it is hot. It is ready. And the king is like, this is your last chance. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego looks at the king, says, King, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. You can almost just sense the we. It's like, hey, you're mad at us. But king, this is between you and God. We don't need to defend ourselves. You got an issue with God. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But if he does not, now this is one of the most significant faith-shaping moments in the Bible, because you get a picture of what their faith is anchored to. They said, hey, we believe God can. We believe God is able to. But even if God doesn't, even if God chooses not to, even if God has different plans, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. You see, again, one of the most faith-shaping moments in the Bible. You see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saying to the king, that you got to anchor your faith to what God is able to do, not what he will do. And so many times, I've done this before. Maybe you're doing this right now. You're anchoring your faith to what God will do, what you want God to do, what you've asked God to do, what you've begged God to do, what you've pleaded God to do, what you've prayed for God to do, what your life group has prayed for you, for God to do, what you have other people around the country, around the world praying to God, telling God, asking God, pleading with God to do. You've anchored your faith what God will do. And when God doesn't do what you want him to do, what you expect him to do, what happens to your faith? It dissipates, it crumbles, it goes floating out to sea, it's gone. And then you ask yourself, God, where are you? And what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, they anchored it to what God was able to do. They're like, God can do anything. Our God has a power to do anything. But if he chooses not to, we're still not going to worship this idol, King. Let me ask you, what's your faith anchored to? What God is able to do or what you want him to do? Because those are two vastly different anchor points. We're told that Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And his attitude towards them changed. Remember, like he was hoping that they would just bow down and worship, right? Just moments, days, we don't know how long right before, right? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar is celebrating Daniel and his friends, right? And the God of Israel. And now he is done with them. His attitude towards them changed, and he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. He commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. I love the specific nature of this story. Listen to this. So these 3 men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. Again, right, fully clothed. And what we know with clothes, I mean, it catches on fire quickly. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men fell into the fire. Just picture what's going on here. They're bound up, they're tied up, the furnace is 7 times hotter, the king gets the strongest men he has around. When they go to take them to the fire, they fall dead. As they fall dead, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall in the fire. Do you think about fear in that moment? It's one thing to say God is able, but I mean, they're in the moment, falling into the fire. Could you imagine the uncertainty? Could you imagine the fear? Could you imagine what was going on within them? We're told that then the king leapt to his feet in amazement. And that he asked the advisors standing around, he goes, hey, weren't there 3 men tied up? Weren't there 3 Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Yeah, there's 3. And his advisors came back and were like, yep, certainly, you're right, king. There was only 3 in there. And the king goes, look, I see 4 men walking around in fire, unbound, unharmed. And then the king goes, but the 4th looks like a son of the gods. The 4th didn't look like a normal human being. The 4th looked divine. The 4th was different. Then Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So they came out of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed, nor their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Now, it is campfire weather right now, right? Fall's in the air. We finally got our entire fire pit sitting area done. It looks amazing. My wife and I had so much fun doing it, right? We love sitting around the campfire. But we all know, you all know, right? The only downside of sitting around the fire is when you're done at night, you smell like smoke. I mean, your hair smells like smoke, your skin smells like smoke, your clothes, all of your clothes, like you're covered in that smoke smell. And so it's like, okay, we got to wash everything, take a shower, right? There's a process afterwards. And I think it's just so interesting that the specific nature of the story, they didn't even smell like fire. They didn't even smell like smoke. And the king said, "Praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent the angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in God and desired the king's command and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree," he makes a new command, "that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," and again, Nebuchadnezzar's a little new in this following God thing, but the command was to cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Okay, it's kind of cool that he wants to make a decree and a command, but I'm pretty sure cutting them into pieces and turning their house into rubble, God was probably like, "Hey, king, let's come up with a different decree." But when he says, "For no other God can save in this way," you talk about an impact that these three had on the life of Nebuchadnezzar. You see, I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think about, for all of us, that we are to anchor our faith. Anchor our faith in what God's able to do, not what he will do. And I tell you, that starts to create a foundation of unwavering faith. No matter how intense uncertainty is, again, around the world or personally, individually within our lives. But you see, that's not the ultimate anchor point. You see, once you get to the place of not what God will do or what he might do or what you expect him to do or expect him not to do or and you get to the place of, "Hey, God, what you're able to do, I'm fine with that. I know what you're able to do." The final step, the final anchor point is to simply say, "I'm anchoring my faith to who God is." Hey, God, I'm all in with you. God, it's about your kingdom now and forevermore. God, is about your purpose. God, is about your work. God, is about what you're doing. God, is about you. And I just want to be a part of what you're doing. God, I just want to be in a relationship with you, whether it works out in my favor or not, whether I like it or not, whether it's frustrating or not, whether it's painful or not. Hey, God, I just want to follow you. You see, ultimately, when you anchor your faith to who God is, no matter the severity, the significance, the intensity of uncertainty and fear in your life, your faith, anchored to who? God, can overcome it all. You see, Jesus not only taught this, he modeled this. Right at the very beginning of his public ministry, Jesus taught us how to pray. He starts with saying, "Our Father who's art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Holy is your name." Many of you have this prayer memorized. The next line, he goes, "Your kingdom come, your will be done." Jesus, from the very beginning, when he says, "Hey, when you pray, remember it's about God's kingdom now and forevermore. It's about God's will now and forevermore. It's about what God is doing and who God is and what he is doing." So he teaches us, hey, when you pray, it's about God's will. But Jesus also modeled it. Right toward the end, right before he's arrested, Jesus is in the garden and he's praying to God. He says, "Hey, God, please take this cup from me. It was Jesus saying, I don't want to go through this painful death. I don't want to go through crucifixion. I don't want to go through what's coming my way in the next 24, 48 hours. God, I just take this from me. And he says, but not my will, but your will be done. Hey, God, if I have to go through this, I'm going to go through this because of who you are. Because of who you are. Jesus taught this, and he modeled it for us. Jesus said, anchor your faith to who God is. I know for me, it came through one of the darkest moments of my life. I've shared a little bit, not much, a little bit over the years about our son. His name's Caden. And you see, my faith was anchored at that point to what God will do, what I expected God to do, what I had asked God to do, what I had pleaded and begged God to do was anchored there. And when God didn't do what I expected him to do, what I told him to do, my faith completely crumbled. My faith, the anchor that I thought was anchored, I just drifted out to sea. When my son passed away, my faith crumbled. That next year was one of the most dark and faith-challenging seasons of my life. To a point where I had some good friends and an amazing wife that walked with me and helped me get to counseling. My wife and I flew out to Fort Collins, Colorado to spend a week of intensive counseling. Honestly, to be really transparent, going there, I thought the counseling was more for her than for me, but the very first session, Dr. John Walker made it very abundantly clear that she was actually in a really good, healthy space in her grieving journey, and I wasn't. Over that week, Dr. Walker asked me to write 3 very specific letters. The first one was a letter from me as dad to my son. I sat at a park and tears just filled my eyes as I tried to write this letter to my son. The second letter he asked me to write was what I thought my son would say to me. Again, I sat at this park in front of a stream on my laptop, tears just engulfed my eyes. One of the most excruciating, emotionally charged moments of my life as I wrote this letter of what I thought my son was saying to me. And then once I got through that letter, he asked me to write a third letter, a letter to God. And you see, that's where my anchor was. Because again, my faith was anchored to what God will do, what I expected God to do, what I asked God to do to save my son, and God didn't. I remember sitting down to write this third letter, and I think in the back of my mind, I was just going to blow off this letter because, again, my anger was still really directed at God because God didn't save my son. God didn't heal my son. God didn't. And I expected him to. I remember sitting down, and I opened up my laptop to write this letter, and tears start to fill my eyes yet again. And this is where I started. I said, "Dear Heavenly Father, I'm not sure exactly where to start. What should be or needs to be said? I guess I ask you to guide my heart and my thoughts." I remember pausing there, and I literally stared at the screen, and those first thoughts said it all. I don't know what to say to you, God. I don't know what to write to you, but I had to. Why? Because Dr. Walker is making me write letters. And then I started to type, and God took me on one of the most healing parts of my spiritual journey ever. I started to write. I said, "First, I know you are God. Your ways are perfect, flawless, without fault. I'm totally confident in that. I know you have the ability to take the circumstances that occur in life and use them for your good. I guess that is why I find myself tugged and pulled in opposite directions. I find myself totally relying on your will, which I know is perfect. I can grasp the thought that you have called the willing to step out in faith, and faith so many times doesn't make sense. I know the stories in the Bible, Abraham and his son Isaac and that long walk up the mountain, Joseph being sold into slavery, and that young girl not married, pregnant. You just call us to follow, to be willing. I get that. I can attempt to get my arms around that. But why Caden? Why him? No, I don't blame you for his death. I know you didn't cause it. But why didn't you save him? Why didn't you work a miracle? Why didn't you reach out and touch him? Why didn't you flick that plug out of his airway? Why didn't you? I guess that is the question that can't be answered. But I wonder, if you gave me the answer, would it resolve the hurt I feel inside? Would it bring closure? Would the answer bring understanding? Would knowing draw me closer to you? Would comprehending take away the longing to hold Caden again? I think the answer is simply no. Understanding the why would probably bring with it another list of questions, hurts, misunderstandings, and anger. Plus, no answer would ever suffice to make sense of the loss of our son. I guess I have to resolve in myself that you are God and I'm not. You love me so very much. You hurt when I hurt. You experience loss when I experience loss. And you grieve when I grieve. And then I wrote, I guess, ... And what God spoke into me, and as I wrote what I wrote next, forever changed my relationship with my Heavenly Father. I guess you totally understand the pain of losing a son. You see, it was in that moment, sitting at that picnic table, where God spoke the most loving, grace-filled words. Hey, Chris, I completely understand what you've gone through. You see, what I hope you know, that God is a God who walks in the fire with you, with me. That's why anchoring your faith to who, not what, is the game changer. Anchor your faith to a God who walks in the fire, who walks in your pain, who walks in your loss, who walks in your uncertainty, who walks in your fear, who walks with you. Because when you anchor your faith there, no matter how intense uncertainty is, no matter how emotionally charged the fear is, God is with you. And He's for you. And He gets everything you're going through. You want to have unwavering faith in uncertain times? Anchor your faith to God, who walks in the fire with you. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for shouting in our pain that you are with us, God. You're with us. Lord, I pray that every single person will know that you step into their pain, into their hurt, into their uncertainty, into the valley, and you walk with them. Here I pray.